And that's what I'm seeing now. I'm seeing people who might have just had anxiety at the beginning, but it's now, and it wasn't treated, and now it's grown into more serious, debilitating form of anxiety, which we've kind of called generalized anxiety disorder. But I mean, that's really just a catch-all phrase for the fact that people are really, really now worried about everything.
Hi, and welcome to the There's Another Way podcast with me, Adam Halverson.
And me, Pete Dolby. And you've come to the place where each episode we'll be shining a light on authentic people who have chosen an alternative path to their new normal to find another way.
Hey there everyone, hope you had a great week and are looking forward to the week ahead. Today we've got the second part of Chris Pagett's podcast. We really hope you enjoyed the first part, and if you did, the second part coming up is even better as we cover even more twists and turns, a closer than close experience with death, and insights from Chris's new career. This really is not to be missed. We hope you enjoy There's Another Way.
And at that point, my numbers were really dropping. I mean, my O2 stats were in the low 80s, and my heart rate had dropped to about 40.
I mean, obviously under 96 is...
Anything under that is not good.
Yeah. So the guy opposite had recognised that you were in trouble at this point.
Oh, you could see I was in absolute agony.
Yeah.
But I was in so much pain I couldn't call out. I couldn't reach the call button. I was just curled up in a ball of pain. So they called for the surgeon to come along. Again, this was the middle of the night. This was about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. So it was the registrar surgeon who came along.
So again, sorry to interrupt, but they've had all day.
Yeah.
And then they wait until the flipping worst time.
So the consultant had seen me that day, and he basically said, "Oh, you'll be fine, you'll be home, but you'll be going home at 5 o'clock." And I wasn't. She was looking at me, and she didn't really know what to do, so she called the consultant. And she had him on speakerphone. And I remember this very distinctly, because you would. He said, "Look, from what you've told me, he's dying. If you don't do anything, you'll be dead within an hour. If you do decide to operate, you've got to be prepared for the fact that you're going in there and you don't know what the problem is. He's had his appendix removed, so obviously something else has happened." And I think at the time they were assuming maybe they'd left something inside of me, like a swab or something, I don't know. But he's like, "You're going to have to do it as an exploratory surgery in the knowledge that he will still die, potentially. So it's up to you whether you want to take the risk." And I am forever grateful that she did take the risk. And she took me, said, "Look, I will do the surgery." So they prepped me. And I've since learned that it's not a good sign when they don't move you from the bed that you're lying on in the ward. They that's the bed that they operate on. That's a really bad sign, apparently, because they're scared to move you.
So they wheeled you on that
bed?
They
will be on that bed into the operating.
Right, okay.
And the operator. So that was a bed I've been just lying in the normal ward.
Sorry, Chris. The lady that's about to perform the operation, you say she's the registrar.
She was the registrar surgeon.
Okay.
Yeah. So she was the on-call surgeon, but she wasn't a consultant.
Okay.
But she did speak to the consultant. But he said he was half an hour away. Yeah. By the time we got there, I was probably going to be dead anyway. Yeah. So he said, "This is on you." And not in a bad way, I don't think. It was just a case of, "Look, you've got to go into this with your eyes open. You could operate on this guy, put him through all the trauma of surgery, and he dies anyway. You've got to make a judgment call about what to do." And she took a gamble, which was great, because I needed that at that point. So I distinctly remember lying there in the room before you go in, the pre-op room, while they're getting everything ready. It was Christmas. There was Christmas music playing, twinkly lights.
Oh God!
And I was lying there, and I could feel I was just dying. I was in so much pain. I felt so sick, more than I've ever felt in my entire life. And I genuinely thought, this is it. If I go under the anaesthetic, I'm not coming out. There's no way I can feel this bad and still survive. So I was lying there for an hour, and it's not often you get the chance to contemplate life from that point of view. And it was really interesting experience, terrifying. I was scared shitless. I was thinking about what did I regret? How did I end up here? What the hell was going on? Why was this happening? All my life I've been an atheist. And I thought, well, is this a point where I need to change that? Do I need to start praying? And I thought, well, no, that would be a bit on the nose, really, even for me.
Did you, at this point, think that the end was nigh?
I definitely thought. I was totally convinced.
Was it a classic, your life flashing before you?
I was on there for an hour, so no, I had plenty of time to think about things. And an hour is a long time when you're thinking at this speed. My mind was just racing through all these different things.
Oh, they're giving you stuff to kind of...
I was in pain, yeah.
Sure.
But I don't know, I think maybe the fear had helped tamp it down a bit.
The adrenaline.
Yeah, because I was absolutely terrified.
Could you sense there was nervousness with the medical stuff?
Oh, God, yeah, totally. In fact, when I went through and the anaesthetist was prepping me, he said to me, you're really stressed. He says, it's fine. It's just it's an exploratory surgery, but, it'll be fine. And I said, well, yeah, but this is my second surgery in 24 hours. And I saw on his face, he was like, oh, okay, well, that's not good. And then he put me under. And I was, as I drifted off, I was totally convinced that was it. I was a goner. 5 hours surgery. I obviously don't remember anything about it, but I've seen the notes because I insisted on it, and I've talked to the anaesthetist. She went in laparoscopically at first because it seemed the safest thing to do. And she could see I was massively infected, that my kidneys were shot, my liver was shot. It was just infection everywhere. And she couldn't figure out why. Because she could see a little sutured little surgical scar where you'd expect the appendix to be. She had the previous surgeon's note saying he'd taken my appendix out. So she was like, what the hell's going on here? I mean, what's causing the infection? So she was hunting around for another source of infection, but couldn't find it. And at that point, I started dying. So I died twice on the table that was there. So the first time she did CPR on me and brought me back, and the second time they had to use a defibrillator on me. The anaesthetist says at one point the surgeon was kind of muttering, will this guy just stay alive long enough so I can save him? Because just stop dying, because that was wasting a lot of time when she wanted to be focused on what was causing the infection. So in the end, she settled for washing out my entire insides with antibiotics, installing a drain from my stomach area, which was seen to be the source of the infection, and intubating me. So they put a tube down my throat to help me with my breathing, so that was the surgical bit. I woke up to just a nightmare. I had a tube down my throat, which they very quickly removed, but it was a horrible experience. I had tubes and wires coming out everywhere. My heart was so weak, they'd put these hydraulic tubes on my legs. So they kind of squeezed in conjunction with to help my heart, because my heart was so weak. My ostats were still terrible.
So you said ostats before. What does that mean? O2
saturation. It shows how much oxygen you've got in your blood. And as Adam said, 96 is good. Once you start drifting down, I mean, really, when you get to the low 80s, you're well on your way to being dead. It just means that your body's not able to process oxygen and not moving it around enough. I woke up to that. I had this drain sticking out of me, this sort of centimetre thick tube coming out of my stomach area. I had a catheter, which fortunately when I put it in, I was under anaesthetic. I'm grateful for that, from what I've heard. But I was still really sick, and they said the surgeon came and she said, I don't know what's causing it. I don't know why you are still this sick. The best we can do is basically flood your system with antibiotics and pray, really. We don't know what else to do now. We can't do any more operations because there's no point, and also it will probably kill you because you're so weak. All we can do is give you antibiotics and see whether there's any improvement.
And I guess you wake up, obviously, I suppose consciously you kick straight back in. And I suppose you're probably initially hoping, it's sorted and it's gone well. And then
I had a moment of euphoria. It was like, my God, I've lived.
Yeah.
And then I looked down and all the pains started, and I thought, what the hell? I thought for a moment, I literally thought it was a bit of an odd thought, but I like my sci-fi. I literally thought that they'd somehow made me into a cyborg because there was so many tubes and wires coming out of my body that I couldn't. What the hell had they done to me? And I couldn't move, and they really didn't want me moving, so they kind of strapped me down. So yeah, it was terrifying again.
Because it must have been, yeah.
So our friend Mark came along and he talked to me about it a bit more and explained what had happened, and he basically said, look, the next 24 hours, you're either going to you've got sepsis, you've gone beyond basic sepsis, you're now in what we call severe sepsis, and you're basically heading towards septic shock, which is total organ failure. The next 24 hours will be, if you turn a corner in the next 24 hours, then you will recover to some extent. But if you don't survive, it's the next 24 hours basically.
Well, Chris, what caused the sepsis? Was it the net result of having the appendix burst, or was it just the fact that you'd had surgery and you'd caught it some other way? How
well, that's a little twist in the tale.
Okay.
As it turns out, the first surgeon hadn't removed my appendix. So my infected appendix, he'd left it in me. He'd removed something called the bloodless fold of Treves, which is a fundamental error by the part of the surgeon. It was an absolute fuck up, excuse my language, but it was about as terrible a thing as a general surgeon can do in that situation. He left my infected appendix inside of me. But then wrote up in his notes that he'd removed my appendix. So the next surgeon didn't have any reason not to believe him.
And it's not obvious, or they could.
No, because my insides were a mess by that point. Yeah. But she could see where something had been. So there was surgical evidence that something had been removed. So she thought, well, that must have been the appendix. It never occurred to her that he hadn't removed it. And that was the problem. They'd left my appendix inside of me, so it was infecting everything by that point. So it had infected my blood, which is what sepsis is, and that had then carried the infection to all my organs, and what was causing the problems and the pain. The pain is extraordinary. I lack the words even now to describe what the pain was like. It was like some kind of. It was like something was chewing and stabbing me over my entire body. There wasn't a single part of me that didn't seem to be hurting. And I couldn't think straight. I mean, I was on quite a lot of drugs as well, which probably didn't help, but it was the pain primarily that was stopping me thinking. I couldn't focus because the pain was just constantly hammering at me. So I was lying there, they poured these drugs through me. It didn't help that I hadn't eaten by this point in 3 or 4 days, hadn't really drank, so they had to put me on a glucose drip as well to try and rehydrate me and keep me going. So I was at a really low ebb anyway, physically, and I was trying to fight off what was a major infection at the same time. But I've got to say, I mean, it would be very easy for me to say that, this first surgeon screwed up and all that kind of stuff, and they did. But after that, I've got to say, the NHS, it saved my life. It did. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop. They kept going. There was never a point when I felt that they gave up on me. The thing shifted from doctors to nurses because there reached a point when the doctors couldn't do any more. And it became about the nurses keeping an eye on me and replacing all the endless bags. I don't know how many bags of antibiotics they poured through me. They seemed to be replacing them every 5 minutes. But the nurse who was in charge of the department, she was absolutely brilliant. So she came to see me at the end of that day. So I'd woken up. So the surgery had been at 1 o'clock in the morning on the Monday morning. I'd woken up at about 8 or 9 o'clock on the Monday. This had all happened during the day where they talked me through everything and put me on the antibiotics. She came to see me at 6 o'clock and she said, look, I'm going off shift now. She said, but I'm back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and you'd better be here. She said, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. She said, you are in for the worst night of your life. She said, but please just remember one thing. She said, just keep breathing. She said, that's all you've got to do. She says, don't think about anything else. Don't think about your wife. Don't think about your kids. I mean, if it helps, great. But just do one thing. She says, you keep breathing. She says, if you keep breathing, you're going to make it. If you stop breathing, then you're dead. So she went off and I was lying there thinking, okay, right, so that's my job tonight. And that was the longest night I can. I mean, it was just.
Is that just to keep the oxygen, keep sort of fresh blood? Did she actually mean anything scientifically by it, or was it almost just a case?
I don't know. I think what she told me afterwards was that it was because everything was shutting down. The moment I gave up and stopped breathing, everything would just shut down.
Stop.
Yeah. As long as I could keep breathing, then there was still oxygen going into my system.
Yeah.
There was still a chance that my body could fight off the infection. I don't know if it was purely scientific. I think it was mostly based on her own experience that the people who survived were the ones who kept breathing and stuck at it and were stubborn enough to keep taking that next breath.
Did you get to sleep that night, or did you stay?
No, God, no. I was in too much pain to sleep. And there is nowhere more miserable than a hospital ward in the middle of the night. I was in the critical care unit, so there was a lot of older gentlemen who would come in. There were 6 of us in the room. So there was me, the guy with the stomach ulcer, and then 4 older blokes who'd been brought in for various reasons. The next morning, only 4 of us were still alive. So 2 of the older guys died in the middle of the night. Fortunately, quite peacefully, but I had that going on as well, which was not encouraging.
No, that messes with your head when you're...
Yeah. So it was a very, 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 very long night. And the crisis point hit about 3 a.m. or thereabouts, because I just felt my body just give up. I just felt it. It's a very weird thing to describe. I mean, it was pretty much on the downward slope anyway, but there reached a point when I tried to take a breath and I couldn't, and I just felt it. I felt that was it. My body had just given up. So I kind of forced myself. I remember what she'd said, and it sounds a bit trite to say this, but that's what I did. I remember what she said, and I thought, I've got to take a breath. So I just forced myself to take this tiny little sip of air. And then I was able to breathe it out, and then I was able to take another tiny little sip of air, and the machines were going off because my numbers were plummeting, and the nurses came over and they were trying to help, and they were encouraging me to keep breathing, and they were thinking whether to intubate me, but they didn't want to do that because they wanted me to breathe on my own, and that was really important. So gradually over the next hour I managed to take bigger and bigger breaths, and that was the corner turned. The antibiotics were working. I'd managed to survive. I was still in a hell of a state. I had kidney failure, liver failure. My heart was all over the place. My lungs were... I'd already had a collapsed lung. My lungs were buggered. But I'd managed to turn a corner.
Could you sense it at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could. Because I felt it when my body went bleh and said that I can't do anymore, and then I felt it again when my body was like, okay, it's clinging on by my fingernails here, but I'm still managing to. I'm going to be okay. And the nurse came, the sister came back the next morning, and she was really delighted that I was still there.
Fantastic.
So over the next 48 hours, I slowly recovered enough where they decided to send me home because I was then at danger of catching an infection, a secondary infection, and if I caught a secondary infection, that would have wiped me out. So I managed to go home, but it was seven days in hospital for an appendectomy. It's not good. So I was home 4 days before Christmas, I think it was, 5 days before Christmas. So that was fun. But another dimension to all of this was at the same time my wife was at home not knowing what the hell was going on. She knew that I had a burst appendix, but, we all know that shouldn't be such, it was dragging on for days and they weren't telling her what was going on, partly because they didn't know themselves what was going on and they didn't want her to worry. So she was having to deal with our daughter and her asking where I was, and she had to stop working and to be at home for our daughter. And so she was really, really stressed about what was going on, didn't know anything. So she was delighted to have me home. But I remember a couple of days after, for the first couple of days, all I could do was just lie there, and I was vomiting, and I was in a right state. I couldn't go to the toilet, couldn't eat, couldn't drink. So I was in some ways getting more, suffering a bit because I was getting very dehydrated. So the district nurse had to come out and put me on a drip and help with that kind of stuff. But I remember after a couple of days being well enough to be able to get up and sort of stagger to the toilet, and I saw myself in the mirror, and I was horrified. I'd been turned into this hunched over, grey-skinned old man. I was a mess. I'd never seen anything like it, because before that I was 40 years old. I was perfectly fit. I was a normal 40-year-old. And then suddenly, within a week, I'd become this, what looked like a wizened old man, hunched over, barely able to move. So yeah, it was a horrible time. It was a horrible Christmas. We did our best to try and keep it as normal as possible, but at that point, I was still on very powerful pain meds, so I really don't remember much about it. They really were very good meds. My first real memories are really just after Christmas, when I started seeing the nurse at the local GP who was helping me with the rehab, and she was excellent. She was absolutely brilliant. I went there and she went through the notes and she was like, "Okay, well, I could talk you through all of this if you want me to." She says, "Is there any questions?" And I did ask a couple of questions and she answered them. And she said, "But, what we need to do now is figure out how you're going to move forward." And the way to move forward, she said, in my opinion, is that you can't dwell on this. She said, what's happened to you is a bit like being attacked with a knife or being in a car accident that wasn't your fault. This thing has happened to you. And in my experience, there are two kinds of people: the people who dwell on it and they never move on and they never recover, or the people who go, right, okay, this is how I live now. This has happened, and I've got to figure out a way of moving forwards. And she says, I really recommend that you do the latter, because that will help you get to a better place, not just physically, but emotionally and everything else. So, and that was great advice. And she really helped me over the next few weeks to get a grip on it, and realise that, okay, what had happened was bad and I had to be very careful, and I had to be very careful about my kidneys and my liver to help them recover. They did, fortunately. But it was a long process, a very long process.
Is it like a grieving process almost, where you had the anger and you had to go through that phase?
Yeah,
and the
absolutely, yeah. It's exactly that process. That I was very angry about what had happened to me. I was angry at the universe for why it had happened to me. Why did my appendix have to be the appendix that went like that? I was still worried about what it meant for the future. Would I ever recover? What would I be able to do? And it wasn't helped that in February, that was when they told me that they hadn't removed my appendix the first time round or the second time round.
So this is 2 months after you'd been home.
That was when they'd sent it off, but I think it's their normal practice to send it off to pathology to check to see if there's any issues. And they sent it back saying, is this a joke? And they literally said, it came back, they showed me the notes. It was like, this isn't the appendix. Why, it's not his appendix. So I met with the chief surgeon, and he said, well, we haven't taken your appendix out. We don't know what that means, because we can't scan you because your insides are such a mess. They're so inflamed that a scan wouldn't work. He said, but there's a number of options. Either it completely blew, in which case you don't have an appendix anyway and you've recovered. It might have partly recovered, or it might still be there. In which case it could go again at any time. And he said, and you're in such a state now that if it goes now, then yeah, you don't have much of a chance of survival. But we can't tell you which of these options it is because we can't scan you.
Which is obviously the worst thing you want to hear when you're mentally still trying to recover.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I remember walking out in a bit of a daze and getting into my car and sitting in my car, and I just burst into tears. Because it was the final straw. I just couldn't take any more. I thought I was going to turn up and they were going to go, oh, well, we're taking your appendix out, and yeah, there was secondary infection, but you've recovered from it and it's all going to be great. And suddenly my whole universe was, well, you could drop dead at any time. I was like, oh, great. But we can't tell you because we don't know. It's like,
And it's I guess ultimately you get to that place where you're just constantly waiting for that. Cool. All right, it was terrible, but you're on your way.
Exactly, yeah.
And obviously, you just didn't get that.
No. Well, it was even worse to a certain extent because I was actually feeling all right by that point. It was a couple of months after it had happened. I'd worked really hard at my rehab. Joe had been brilliant. In fact, everybody had been brilliant. My family, my friends, everybody had been really supportive. And so I was well enough to drive myself to the hospital. So I remember I was driving there, the sun was shining, it was quite a nice day, I was thinking quite positive about things, I managed to find a parking space that was right by where I was supposed to get in, which is a miracle at Stoke Mandeville anyway. So I was feeling really positive, and then suddenly my entire world collapsed again.
And the realisation that at any point in the last 2 months could have been...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. That I was totally delusional, as it turns out, that I potentially hadn't recovered, that there might have been this ticking time bomb. But I talked it over with Joe. I've got a friend of mine who's a gastroenterologist, so he was brilliant. I talked to him, and he explained things, and he said, look, if you do still have your appendix, you'd be really unlucky for it to burst again. He says, I mean, if it does burst, yeah, you're going to be in a really bad way, but you'd be really unlucky for that to happen. So he reassured me a little bit, and we kind of made a joke of it that it was Schrodinger's appendix. We didn't know whether we had it. It could have been there, could not be there. It could kill me, it might not kill me. And we won't know until they do a scan.
But obviously you've got to get comfortable and try and live knowing with that unpredictability.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, by that point, I'd had to put my PhD on hold by that point as well. So that had gone out the window, which was annoying because I'd invested a lot of my life into that journey.
There's someone up there or somewhere that really doesn't want you to complete academics.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? Yeah. That's a scary thought. Yeah. It's my destiny to never finish my PhD.
But if there's a positive in the last few months, it's that you feel like you're in a much better place. Actually, having a third surgery meant that you'd be able to handle it, whereas if you hadn't had it...
Yeah. So I had my scan in May, and of course it was still there. So the surgeon said, I can remove it if you want.
That's 3 months after they told you that you could...
Yeah, it took that long for me to get to the point where they could realistically scan, do a CAT scan and see what was going on. He said, he says, it's at the moment it seems perfectly fine. He says, but I can remove it as a precautionary measure if that would make you feel better. So again, I talked to a number of people, thought about it, and I thought, well, you know what, I want to draw a line under this. So I did. I had my third appendectomy.
That must have been a very nerve-wracking experience going back for 30.
Actually, wasn't too bad because at that point I knew that I wasn't sick. I felt okay, and it was an elective surgery technically.
Okay.
So there wasn't the same level of stress, and I did kind of think this time round. I mean, it was the chief surgeon who did it. He had to get. I mean, I had it done at the Chiltern, the private hospital. And he had to get special permission to do it there because he wasn't normally registered there. So they went to a lot of effort to make me feel comfortable and make it feel as least stressful as it possibly could be. And in the end, it was just a standard appendectomy. It only took him an hour. And bless him, he took photos to prove that he had taken. So I've still got the photos where he's kind of holding it in one. He's sort of, he said, there it is. I cut it off and I brought it out, and here it is. So I am now 100% sure that I don't have an appendix. So that did draw a line under the end of it. My recovery from that was the same as most people's in that situation. Within a week or so, I was absolutely fine.
It must have been such a relief to know that it had finally happened.
Yeah, it did draw a line under it all, but that was nearly 6 months later by the time it had all been it was the time it was all finished. So it was a horrendous 6 months for something which shouldn't have happened. And was down, and I want to be clear about this because I always am clear, it was down to a surgeon's incompetence. And people have said to me, well, why haven't you sued or anything like that? Yeah. But there doesn't seem much point in suing the NHS for money because they're tax funded anyway, so I'll be kind of suing myself, bizarrely. But what I did try and do is make sure that he felt a sense of responsibility. So I think the chief surgeon made sure that anyway. I don't know if he's called the chief surgeon, but that's what I call him. So he was the head of department, so I think he definitely made sure that this guy was aware of how badly he'd screwed up.
Do you think they've ever used your case in
they
training?
Have, yeah. They have, yeah.
How not to...
Yeah, well, how not to make... Apparently it's presented as a case study of you can't assume anything.
Yeah.
You may think you know human anatomy, but human anatomy is not as straightforward as you would think.
Yeah.
And interestingly, at the time I was told that 25% of people, their appendix is unusually placed. Over the last 10 years, because it's been 10 years now since it happened, it's become more and more a case of actually, no, the appendix is much more varied than we think. So surgeons, I think, now are much better at thinking, I need to be careful about what I'm looking at. I need to double check that it is the appendix before I remove it, because otherwise what happened to me could happen to other people. So yeah, I mean, the only impact now is trying to explain it when I go for medical insurance and things, and they say, have you had any surgeries? And it's like, well, yeah, I've had 3 appendectomies. And they're like, why have you had 3 appendectomies?
Jesus.
I think I should technically be in the Guinness World Book of Records, unless somebody's had 4 appendectomies. I don't know, but maybe I should apply. So that was a big change in our lives again, and derailed what I was originally doing. So after that, I was at home, and I was really just focused on the domestic stuff because I was still recovering. And that went through all the way through to the following December. And then I started getting really anxious and not sleeping properly. And I realised that I was being triggered by Christmas, of all things. Because what had happened to me...
That's easily done at the best of times. But,
well, exactly. I mean,
it happens to him every year.
But Christmas music and the twinkly lights and that whole... And, and it really started... And I started having flashbacks. And so at that point, I decided I needed to go into therapy to figure out what the hell was going on, because it was really messing with my head.
Was it a difficult decision, Chris, or was it you just knew straight away you'd have to go and speak? Because I mean, what blows...
It was a difficult decision, and also I didn't tell my wife or my family that I was doing it.
Why
Partly because I didn't know what was going on.
Okay.
I really didn't. I didn't understand, because I thought maybe it was PTSD, but I thought, well, why would I? I mean, what happened to me was awful, but I didn't necessarily think that I was worthy, if you like, of having PTSD, even though I was showing a lot of the symptoms of it. So I found a therapist and started working with her. And she was clear right from the start. She's like, no, you've got PTSD. You've done a psychology degree. You've done math. You should know this. You definitely have PTSD. But there's a reason why people don't diagnose themselves, I guess. From her perspective, it was absolutely clear. And I was triggering because of the visual and auditory associations that I had of that period. Right. Tinsel still sets me off. It's these are triggering incidents that remind me of what had happened, and then my mind just spirals downwards.
How does it manifest? What do you sort of when you say you get triggered?
Well, the background was insomnia and anxiety, and then increasingly I would get panic attacks, really bad, freezing panic attacks, and they were crippling. And they could happen when I was driving. I mean, I'd be going to pick my daughter up from school and I'd have to pull over and just try and control myself because a Christmas song had come on somewhere, how it triggered me. So my therapist, I worked with her for 3 or 4 months and managed to turn a corner there. And it really worked for me. Partly because I understood a lot of what she was doing, so we could use a bit of a shorthand because we were from the same field. Partly because she was excellent. She is excellent. She's retired now. But also partly because I'm quite a pragmatist about things. If things need to be done, they need to be done. So I worked the problem with her. So I managed to turn a corner on that. And it helped that Christmas obviously doesn't go on all year, thank God. So that faded away. And so we got to the spring and I was back on track again and thinking about, well, what do I do now? And up until that point, I'd been very clear that I never wanted to be a therapist. If I was going to do anything, I would be on the scientific side, the neuroscience side of understanding the brain and the mind and things like that. But I now had a completely different perspective. I thought, well, actually, yeah. I mean, she's, in her own way, saved my life again. Because there's no way I could have got through that without her help. So I did. I decided to become a therapist. So I retrained over the next 6 months and then started my own therapy practice the following January, which has now been running for 5 years.
Absolutely brilliant.
And it's turned out to be the right move.
Yeah.
It is incredibly rewarding. But I think it's particularly rewarding because a lot of the things that I deal with CBT, depression, anxiety, things like that, I've been through myself.
Yeah.
So I can speak from experience.
It gives credibility, doesn't it, when you can
understand
where...
And a deeper emotional understanding connection with them. There's no judgment with me at all. There can't be because I've been there. Yeah. And there is still a lot of stigma around mental health. Yeah. And one of the things I think I'm good at is removing that stigma from people saying, look, it can happen to anybody. It happened to me.
Yeah.
And I'm very open and quite happy to talk about it. I mean, at some points in the whole process, I was suicidal. Yeah. I was thinking, well, I might as well just end it. So I had depression, I had anxiety, the whole thing, PTSD. So it's been great, really, to sort of use that to help people and help people on a better track. Now, if I've got my timings right, they sort of kicked in. I started my practice the year before COVID struck. So that was another dimension to all of this. So in the first year, I was building my practice up, just starting to get a reputation. Oddly enough, one of the things that I did, which I thought was a unique selling point, was I did all of my sessions over Zoom or, well, by video conferencing. That was my unique thing. And then COVID hit.
Yeah.
So two things there. First of all, my unique thing went out the window because everybody was using video conferencing for everything. But on a more serious note, the whole world changed. My practice changed completely. I ended up dealing with a lot of fear-based anxiety clients, quite rightly. But I also ended up supporting the frontline medical staff. So I was working for a charity there who were supporting them. So this was a charity basically where frontline healthcare workers, if they couldn't take it anymore, they could call the number and speak to somebody, and we'd be there for them. And they were. I mean, it's horrifying what happened to them. I mean, it's an overused word, heroes, but they definitely were.
They're suffering from PTSD themselves, going.
Oh, they got it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I don't even know if it was post-trauma. It was happening to them at the time.
And obviously, I guess what you're referring to is just dealing with high volumes of chaos, very seriously ill people, just constantly. And obviously,
their world changed very, very quickly, didn't it? And suddenly they were exactly that. They were having to deal with chaos. They were under-resourced. They didn't have the right protection. Nobody really knew what COVID was going to turn into at that point.
We know there was a lot of ill advice on how to treat it.
Yeah. So depression, anxiety, trauma, and not just there, but in my private practice as well. It all became about COVID. And then over time, it morphed a little bit so that it became less fear about COVID, but then a bigger issue about how do you cope in a COVID world with lockdowns, the lack of social interaction, having your kids at home, having to educate them. Again, the whole world turned on its axis, didn't it? There, I mean, it was a very, very bizarre time, and I did my best to help people, but it did often feel like it was a very small amount of difference in a tidal wave of a tsunami of mental health issues, and it often felt as if, and I've spoken to other therapists at the time about this and since, that we kind of felt that we were overwhelmed as well. It escalated so quickly, and we were unable to help as many people as we would have liked, which I think has contributed. And I'm not saying we didn't try, we did, but there's a physical limit to how much time you can spend talking to people. And my sessions, which were normally an hour, were morphing into an hour, 2 hours, because I didn't want to stop talking to people. So I had to stop planning. So it was very chaotic. And I think that has directly led to the fact that there is now a major mental health issue in this country, because a lot of people weren't treated at the beginning of when they started to have these issues. And I think it has now grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And that's what I'm seeing now. I'm seeing people who might have just had anxiety at the beginning, but it's now, and it wasn't treated. And now it's grown into more serious, debilitating form of anxiety, which we've kind of called generalized anxiety disorder. But I mean, that's really just a catch-all phrase for the fact that people are really, really now worried about everything, about their lives, about how the world is, about whether, I mean, not so much about dying, but kind of what is the point? We've been through all of this and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And that affects everything that they do. I mean, once it gets to that level, it's awful, because it means you're spending all your life at this level of anxiety, and that means that you can't really enjoy your life. It changes your relationships with the people around you. It's a terrible place to be. It really is.
And you throw social media into the mix, and all the youngsters that are using that all the time, where everything's amplified anyway, and negative stories reign, don't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's good cause for feeling this way, and I don't think the media helps, and I don't think social media helps, but I think it's also a little bit lazy to dump it all at them. I mean, one of the things that I've been looking at recently is conspiracy theories. Now, whether you believe them or not, what's really interesting about that world is that pre-COVID it was things like flat Earth and did they land on the moon and stuff which I'm probably getting assaulted on Twitter or X or whatever we call it now for saying this, but stuff that I would consider a little bit balmy, a little bit wacky, a little bit fringe. But now it's become much more a sort of, we don't trust authority, we don't trust the government, we don't trust scientists, we don't trust experts, we don't trust the police, we don't trust anybody. So it feels like, and lots and lots of people are buying into these conspiracy theories. And like I said, it's not to me to say one way or the other, but it's the fact that the nature of what they consider to be a conspiracy has changed. That it's now a complete distrust in what used to be the things which kept us safe. You can't, people don't trust, as I said, people don't trust government, they don't trust scientists, and that raises the anxiety level. And I think that's a sign that the anxiety levels are now getting to dangerous levels, I think.
It's a really interesting point for me, and it's actually very topical, even from a conversation that you and I had today.
Okay.
I'll be honest with you. I think the last 3 or 4 years, for me personally, on some of this trust level, has completely shifted my perception. Not to the point where it makes me anxious, but it's certainly, and the reason is not because I remember pre-COVID, I had colleagues, I'd worked with people who just, like you rightly said, would spend so much energy and time on really stuff that they couldn't control. It's almost like if you've not got anything else to worry about, just, why get involved? Focus on what's important. Do you think that the issue with what's happened during this is actually, they're not conspiracy theories because they've spilt over into people's reality? So for example, for example, if you take COVID and a lockdown, obviously something's happened that has then now spilled in a decision that's been made, which has affected, let's say, freedom, people's perception of freedom. And so for me, it's a case of like, I wouldn't class myself as a conspiracy theorist, but I will be honest with you. The questions I'm asking, the trust levels I have been massively affected. And I have a lot of questions and I want a lot of answers. That doesn't mean to say that I don't trust doctors. That doesn't mean to say that I don't think the NHS did an amazing job and they should, et cetera, et cetera. I almost shouldn't have to caveat it. But do you think that's sort of why there's been this completely unexpected spillover into people's realities?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That, like I said, something which might have been considered fringe before has, and I say, I think that's sort of the ultra end of the spectrum, is that conspiracy theory side of things. But it's because you're absolutely right. People's reality has now shifted to the point where there is a breakdown in trust. So for most people, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't trust doctors, like you said, or don't trust the government. But there's a lot more suspicion now and a lot more questioning and a lot more cynicism. Now, it might be that we needed that. I don't know, but it does mean that there is now a fundamental breakdown in trust. And while some areas they seem to be trying to do their best to regain that trust, in other areas, people are taking advantage of it. I mean, there's no denying that the rise of populist leaders, for example,
100%.
is taking advantage of the fact that we don't trust the old ways of doing things anymore, so they can come along and say, this is a new way of doing things, and people buy into that. And again, it's not for me to say whether it's right or wrong, but it's something that perhaps they wouldn't have done 5 years ago.
But I also think it's really interesting, I haven't thought about this before, is actually how then in turn that lack of mass, sort of growing amount of distrust can actually seep into the people who aren't quite ready to deal with it. Because I think a lot of the people I talk to about this stuff, I think that there's quite a high level of cognitive dissonance. And I've kind of tried to wonder if sort of mentally it's a defense mechanism. I don't want to go there. I need my narrative to be what it was pre-COVID. I need to keep in that safe place. Please don't question it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I mean that would be a perfectly understandable reaction, wouldn't
Absolutely.
it be? That if we could erase those 3 years from everybody's minds and from history, I think some people would prefer that to be the way it was and to go back. But I don't think we can do that.
No.
Of course we can't. That's not the case. I don't think we absolutely can't. So we've now got to live with what is undeniably a new reality. That new reality is that there has been a breakdown in trust with the things that used to keep us safe. They may very well still be keeping us safe, but there is that breakdown in trust. And I think there's also that realization of quite how fragile things are. So things shifted so quickly. I mean, I distinctly remember in February not even thinking, I think I'd maybe heard of COVID. And then, within a few weeks, we were in lockdown.
I remember the first case that came to Wickham. Do you remember the hazmat suit? We're like, it's not far away. But the interdependency of all the systems around the world globally.
Yeah,
and
the whole thing just went boom and collapsed.
Yeah.
I think that has shifted people's perceptions as well, and made them realise that actually this whole thing is a lot more fragile than we perhaps thought. And I'm not talking about necessarily things like global supply chains. I mean, they've proven to be frighteningly vulnerable to all of this.
Absolutely.
Global financial systems, but even our own governments and even our friendships and our relationships have proven to be different to how we perhaps thought they were. We were all there in the first 6 months, on doing Zoom quizzes and everything else. But very quickly, we kind of all shrunk our worlds, I think. We stopped doing that. We stopped, it changed who we were.
Reassess.
And it's a long way to come back from that, if we ever will. My daughter talks about it, that, she really does feel that she suffered in those 2 years. She missed out on a lot of social stuff. She had to work through most of her GCSE time by herself with a screen and people being on the screen. But it's not healthy for teenagers to do that. I mean, that kind of late teenage period is when you are really learning a lot of vital social skills, and we rip them out of that.
It's the younger generation that I'd worry about most, and that going through that, because we've got the benefit of experience that we can draw upon for this kind of stuff. But for them, I think when you're a child and you look at major news stories, I think when I was whatever it was, the Iraq War in the 90s, you see the missiles flying on TV, and it was terrifying, and I think for kids, these stories are amplified anyway. To go through something seismic like we did with COVID at that age, I think it's going to have a knock-on effect for you.
It is, yeah. Isn't it? Well, I think even as adults, I get what you're saying, that we have the benefit of experience, but we also have the problem of expectation. We've lived all this time and without any major disruptions, really, and then suddenly this thing happened which did tear our lives apart. And the sense I've got is that on the one hand, there's a pressure to return back to normality, like the whole, you can't work from home anymore, you've got to go back into the office, that whole thing, which I think is being pushed on us too quickly. I think we haven't been given time to adapt. So we had to adapt quickly to everything shutting down, and now it feels like we're having to be forced to adapt to, we've got to go back to normal. And I don't think we can. I think that's part of the trigger that's causing a lot of people to feel anxious, that they're feeling that, they're not given time to process any of this. The demands of the world seem to be pushing them in a way that isn't necessarily how they feel, and the numbers are frightening. I mean, every day it feels like there's a new statistic out that some group or another has been heavily affected by. I think the latest one was that there are now more under 25s who are off work for mental health than there have ever been before.
I heard a stat recently that something like some insane percentage in America of white male men are now out of work, but like it's something frightening. Like under 30, the percentage is like in the 30%, or like literally just sat in a basement playing video games.
Yeah. Well, you can, to a certain extent, you can kind of understand why. I mean, that's. You could argue it's an escape into fantasy or control or whatever. But it also shows again that this breakdown in connection with the real world. That sort of feeling of, well, what's the point? If all of this can be taken away by COVID, by governments, by whatever, then why not sit in my basement doing what I enjoy?
I think also what's even more nuts is obviously COVID was terrible, but sorry, we're sounding a bit morbid here, but the case fertility rate was quite low. I mean, I think what people have now realised is that if you have anything which is 4 or 5% of as in nasty, as in that literally you've got total shutdown. Like that is a reality. As in things just don't work from that point. Which again, it's not, that isn't a high number. It's like that shows the fragility of what can happen.
Well, I think that's the word. It's all very fragile, and it's hard to pretend that it's otherwise. And that seems to be what the government, what the media want us to do. They want us to all pretend that everything is fine, that we've gone back to normal, and we can't. We're not there yet, and we might never be.
And I guess obviously you can't go into patient, confidentiality?
Of course I can. No, I can't. No, but I can talk in general terms, of course.
So do you find that actually this is the crux of what you're dealing with is sort of meaning? What's the point? Is that sort of where?
Yeah, really. I mean,
Wow.
that is the vast majority of what I deal with at the moment.
Wow.
And it sometimes manifests itself as depression, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as both. There's been a rise in. So I don't do drug or alcohol addiction, but I do deal with other addictions like social media addiction, and that's definitely on the rise. There's a lot of warning signs out there that there's some major issues. And the government, and I'm going to say this out loud, the government is doing bugger all about it.
Yeah.
They keep sweeping it under the carpet and pretending like it doesn't exist. Now, I understand they've got a major crisis on the clinical side of the NHS, but I think it is a real oversight on their part that they are ignoring the mental health side of things. I mean, if you want to get treated in Buckinghamshire at the moment with a GP referral on the NHS, it's 2 years.
I've heard, yeah.
That's not acceptable. In 2 years, any mental health issue can really spiral out of control to the point where it becomes almost impossible to treat. And these things are genuinely debilitating. If you are, depressed isn't feeling sad. Depressed is clinical depression is that you don't want to do anything. You don't even want to get out of bed. It's that sense of, what is the point of me doing anything because everything is pointless.
And when we spoke before, because leading up to this podcast, I think I asked you a question of the difference between anxiety and depression, and I think I hope you don't mind me sort of paraphrasing you, but you sort of said, anxiety we can treat, depression we can manage, and
roughly,
sort of again, it's probably a bit unfair.
No, it's fine.
But the reason I say that is because you argue that anxiety more can morph into depression, and obviously, again, if we're waiting 2 years, we're not getting the right treatment. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, it's a fair point. Yeah, absolutely. So depression is something you do have to kind of live with. You can't really cure it. It's a bit like addiction. It's always there, so you learn how to manage it. Anxiety, to a certain extent, you can treat. But what I meant by that was the fact that anxiety itself is not a bad thing. Anxiety is a really useful response to the world.
Fight or
it's
flight,
what keeps us safe.
Yeah.
So, anxiety is a good thing. I mean, when you're walking home at night and it's dark, being anxious is a really useful thing. It heightens your senses, fight or flight, and also it makes you think differently about things. You start thinking about, your brain starts literally playing out scenarios. Well, if this happens, I'll do this. If this happens, I'll do that. Anxiety, when it needs to be treated, is that feeling is when that response has got out of control and is being triggered by things that are inappropriate.
Yeah.
Walking down a dark street, you should be anxious. You shouldn't be made anxious by your toaster, kind of thing. I'm being a bit flippant there, but
absolutely.
So it's a different thing. Whereas it's not, in most cases, people's natural state to be depressed.
Yeah.
So you can bring them back much further. But with treating anxiety, you don't want to erase anxiety. You don't want people to think the world is an entirely safe place because they'll walk out their front door and be hit by a bus. So it's a bit more about balancing it there. But you can with the right tools, and CBT is effective at this, bring them back to a more suitable level of anxiety. So that's what I meant in terms of treating it. You can do that. With clinical depression, it's much more about managing it, because once you go down that route, it's almost impossible to. I mean, I've been diagnosed with clinical depression myself, and you can manage it. And you can normally manage it with the right help very effectively, but it like I said, it's a bit like addiction. It'll never go away. It'll always be a part of you. And the same with anxiety, but it should be a part of you, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure I'm explaining this terribly well, but
I hope I haven't taken a nice conversation at snooker and
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I just don't want people to think that
absolutely.
They often are very linked. because depression can lead to anxiety, and uncontrolled anxiety can also lead to depression. It's unusual for people just to have one single thing.
Okay.
CBT tends to break that out and say, okay, well, first we'll treat the anxiety and then we'll treat whatever else is there. But that's because of the nature of CBT and the way that it has to change people's behaviours. It's difficult to change behaviours to achieve two different things at the same time, so it's better to break that out a little bit.
Right.
But other forms of therapy do approach the whole. The more psycho-based therapies, the talking therapies, they do tend to approach it as a more holistic thing. So there's different approaches. I'm probably going too technical here.
No,
but,
it's fascinating.
So, I mean, the key point really is that these are things which are now spiralling and getting more and more, and people are getting worse.
And can I just ask as well, because I've always been very interested in it, and the difference between almost, let's say, chemical-based imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, this very, very poor, I'm not doing any service to the professionals in here, but for example, I look at something like bipolar, where my understanding is it's a case of, it's actually almost like a medical sort of imbalance. With depression, would you say that it is primarily a medical, let's say, chemical imbalance, or would you say that, for example, so what I'm trying to get at here is, I don't know the answer. I have some theories, but for example, with COVID happening, and let's say a spike in depression, that's to me more environmental, that's more circumstantial. So what I've always been very, very interested in to make sure that we're actually treating it with the sort of severity and seriousness that we should be is, so for example, I had a friend who killed himself, and he had bipolar, and he was completely unhinged unless he was on I think lithium or whatever it may have been. But he just got to a point where he couldn't function, and he didn't want to be on the drugs because because obviously lithium just levels you, and he hated it.
Yeah.
And he drank a lot. So, but again, my sort of thing with him is that he got dealt a really, really bad card, as in just was wired in a way that was always going to set him on that path. I'm not saying that's my conclusion. It's sort of what I've pondered on, and then obviously then you have depression that sort of seems to happen or can be triggered. Or so, and again, I don't know if you have the answers to this, but it's something where, and I have a follow-up question afterwards. But
nobody has the answers. But what I can say is that there are certain mental health issues which are most definitely and should be treated in the clinical sphere, and bipolar is one of them. And there are other mental health issues which can be treated and are better treated by therapy. And there is a crossover. So, quite often my clients will be on anti-anxiety meds or particularly antidepressants while having therapy, because the two things can work very well in conjunction. And on the clinical side of things, with something like bipolar, there might be some form of therapy, but the main thrust is to treat it medically, as I understand it. What I do know is that from my perspective, if I was talking to somebody and I thought they were bipolar, I would absolutely push down the clinical route. Same with multiple personality disorder. There are certain things. I mean, there's it's called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. I think I'm going to get in trouble for not that. Anyway, it's called the DSM. Anyways, it's kind of the holy grail of looking at mental health issues and describing them. And that makes it pretty clear that, there are things which are definitely clinical, things which can be helped more by therapy, and there is a bit of a crossover. But so, I mean, the depression is an excellent example. People respond most effectively, in my experience, if they are on antidepressants, because it gives them a bit of a window where they can feel better about themselves, and that can then be built on with the CBT, and then they can come off the meds and get on with their lives using the CBT. But the meds are always there in case they need them. So if they do have a crisis, then they can always go back to that. So it's finding that balance between the two. it's becoming more complicated because it turns out that what we've been using as antidepressants might not be working how we think they work. But that's often the case, that the drugs are developed and they work, and nobody stops to go, well, how do they work? Because they work. And,
I've heard a bit of this. So is it SSRIs
Yeah.
and the sort of serotonin sort of management is...
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that they don't work at all. That's not my place to say that.
Actually,
but the research is showing that they don't necessarily work in the way that we thought, and that there might be other ways of approaching this.
Right.
It's a bit like treating insomnia. I mean, the ways that we thought of treating insomnia 10 years ago, things like sleep hygiene, things like that, don't necessarily work. In actual fact, it's about helping people work through the voices in their heads that are keeping them awake. So sleep hygiene is a great thing, and it helps people, have a nice bed and whale noises and on the whole thing, and that can help, but only as a very short-term measure. The underlying insomnia is still there, and it seems to be much more linked to what we call an unquiet mind. So most people can sleep and shut down the voices in their heads, and we do all have multiple voices in our heads. We think we have this single coherent voice, but we don't. People who have insomnia seem to have trouble shutting down those voices. So while they're lying there asleep at night, it's almost like as if it's a continual conversation going on in their head, and that's keeping them awake. So you have to treat that rather than...
Got you.
So all of these things are constantly developing. So antidepressants do work.
Yeah.
They just don't work in the way that necessarily we thought they did. And they work best in conjunction with therapy. And that's the bit where there are problems now. It's getting access to that therapy. Interestingly, I've recently just had to shut down my website because all I was getting from it was people ringing me up saying, I need treatment. My GP has said that I'm depressed, or and I need therapy, and so can you help me? And I'm like, well, yeah, I can, but I'm a private therapist. I don't work for the NHS. And then people are like, well, I can't afford to pay. So, and that was virtually all I was getting, which wasn't the case even 2 or 3 years ago. And that shows that people are now desperately reaching out all over the place. There's a real need for this to be addressed. And I don't have the answers. I don't. But then again, I'm not the government, so I equally don't have the government's resources.
So I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, and I guess I don't want to put you on the spot from a professional perspective. It's not fair. So tell me if I'm asking to. It's with a view to. I've got in trouble before, for example, about. I'm a huge advocate of the attention and the seriousness that mental health is, obviously we now know, is starting to get taken. Maybe, well, you know better than me, but it feels like it's got the attention it needs. The problem is now managing it.
Yeah.
So I'm reading a book at the moment that was referred to me by Bruce, who's been on this podcast, called The Comfort Crisis. Now I'm going to ask, and I mean this in the most positive way, is are we also getting, and I'm not trying to say that the people who are reaching out to you and, but have we gone too far? Now what I mean by that is I struggle with this balance with my kids, which is we know that being resilient, being forced to go through difficult things, overcoming challenges, perception of failure, building self-confidence, we know that's important. I think that's a given, right? I don't think any of us would disagree with that, which is, almost like you said, just say yes, take on the challenge.
And deal with the consequences.
Deal with the consequences, learn that there isn't that failure. Where I've also got concerned with, particularly COVID, the amount of screen time, the amount of what people are getting as their influence and what they're thinking is their environment, and obviously with the rise in sort of awareness about self-identity, being quite insular, looking inwards. Do you think almost there is a case, and again, I'm asking this from a healthy perspective. I am not, and I've got in trouble before for raising what I've felt pragmatic questions about, let's say, the mental health epidemic. Are drugs always the right thing? I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying, like, sometimes are we too quick to go there and not, let's say, deal with therapy? And I suppose what I'm getting at is I'm sort of fascinated by this threshold of, come on, like let's build resilience, let's push, versus, you know, like no, this is something that's got to be dealt with and needs clinical or therapy attention. Again, I'm not sure I've articulated that question very well, and if it sort of
okay. I guess what I would say to that is that most of this comes through GPs,
right,
and GPs take mental health very seriously, but they get 10 minutes to assess somebody.
Yeah.
It takes me, and I'm trained to do this, 2 hours plus to even start to get an idea for whether somebody is suffering from a mental health issue, what that is, and that's not even then an idea of necessarily the route to treat it.
Yeah.
GPs are expected to do that in 10 minutes. I genuinely don't know how they do it. So there might be an element that they are constantly operating on the side of caution and saying, well, look, I'll sign you off from work. I will give you anti-anxiety meds, or I'll sign you off for stress, and and they do their best to say, well, you then need to follow up with some kind of therapy. But there just isn't the support mechanism there. So I get what you're saying. How's this gone too far? And everybody thinks they've got mental health issues.
And I don't think that.
Yeah, I know, but
yeah.
And I think at the moment the system is so overwhelmed that GPs are doing the best they can, and they are the gatekeepers in this, without a doubt. There's lots of private therapists out there, and we can interact with people directly. But it always works better if the GP is involved in that discussion, purely because there might need to be some kind of clinical support there. And GPs just don't have the time. So even if they were trained, and most of them aren't to the extent where they can make those kind of decisions, they don't have the time to do the actual assessment. So somebody comes in. So, I mean, in 10 minutes, they come in and they say, well, I'm feeling depressed. The GP goes, okay, well, how does that manifest itself? What does it look like? They give an answer. It may very well be that they've learned that answer off TikTok,
Yeah, exactly.
and know what to say. And then the GP is clinically bound to treat them for what they said. And that's the problem with mental health issues.
Yeah.
It's not like you're walking in with a slashed wrist or a rash or anything that can be assessed empirically. Some of these things some mental health issues can be assessed empirically by experts. The vast majority of them can't. And I mean, I've been doing this for a while now, and I have, as I said earlier, I've studied this for a long time, and even I get it wrong. So there have been situations where I've started people down one route and then realised 2 or 3 weeks in that actually, no, that's not the case. The underlying problem is something different.
Right.
And that's after I've spoken to these people for hours. GPs have got minutes.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So I think there might be an element of that people are saying or guiding their GP that they've got something and it might, but it's really them self-diagnosing, which is a dangerous thing.
Exactly. And I think that's almost, because I don't want to at all sound cynical. I think, and actually for the record, I almost think it's healthy for everybody to have therapy if they can. As in terms of someone to talk to unconditionally. And so I'm not in any way, shape or form saying that people shouldn't, even if they have a shred of doubt, if they're genuinely worried about their mental health, they should take some advice. I think, again, where I'm concerned is the things we see on TV. Like you said, it's a lazy argument, but the things that we see on TV, the things that kids are now getting bombarded with screen time, and let's face it, like as parents, we all let them do it too much. You know what I mean? And what I'm getting concerned about, and I really love a guy, which he's very, very well known now, called Gabor Mate, where, he has a belief system that we live in a toxic society, toxic culture that is shaping these belief systems. And I think that's where I'm not at all saying that, there shouldn't be this, let's say, almost over-diagnosis, because let's take care of people. But I think where I'm getting concerned, and it ties in with what we said about COVID earlier, is are we actually creating environments now that are conducive for people's mental health. You know, you look at the media bombardment during COVID. I'm convinced that Sky News wanted everybody to be terrible. I had to be terrified. I had to turn it off. It was it was a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't listen to any mainstream news. I don't read newspapers anymore because it's a pointless exercise. And you know, when you dip back in, because I do occasionally, you feel your anxiety levels rising.
Yeah.
And then you start worrying about things which are outside of your control.
Yeah.
So two things from that I would say. I mean, coming back to the diagnosis thing, as I said, it is difficult for GPs to do it. I mean, if somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I think I've got West Nile fever," you can do an empirical test and say, well, you don't. If they come in and say and describe the classic condition of being depressed, which they've learnt off social media, or their mate has said they've done it and they've spread it around, it's almost impossible for a GP to deny that, because there's no empirical way to do that. The best they can do is suggest a treatment and see what happens. So that's the first thing. Absolutely, we live in a toxic age, and it's terrifying. And I've always restricted my daughter's time on social media. I encouraged her to not use social media. She didn't for a very long time. I don't use any social media. I mean, professionally, I've got an account on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it now. Twitter, formerly known as X. No, X, formerly known as Twitter. But that's only for professional reasons. I have no personal footprint on social media at all. And people go, well, you know, aren't you missing out? And it's like, well, there might be an element that I occasionally miss out on something, but it's not worth the toxic flow that you get otherwise, in my personal opinion.
I absolutely agree, yeah.
But it is undeniable that lots of people do buy into that toxic flow. So one of the things I do is help people with social media addiction. And that is kind of, it's really quite tragic. It's one of the things that emotionally gets me, because this is perfectly normal people who have been leading perfectly normal lives, and everybody is on their phones and everybody is using social media, but for them it's become this toxic, really toxic place that is causing them then to have mental health issues. But the root cause is the pressure and the toxic nature of social media itself. Yeah. Now, not everybody succumbs to it, and I actually think people are more robust than we tend to give them credit for. But it's not great that they have to be robust at all against something which is supposed to be a communication tool to help people. I mean, the social media is supposed to be social. Yeah. And I think that's the bit that I think causes me concerns about the whole thing. That I think I genuinely do think people aren't as affected as the media would like us to think by social media. Right. But only because they have to be on guard the whole time. And I've had conversations with my daughter and her friends about this, that, you know, they say, well, yeah, we're fine because we recognise that a lot of what's on social media is horrible, so we shut ourselves off. Stuff happens, we ignore it. With the videos appear, we ignore it. You know, we get comments from boys or things, saying horrible things or suggesting, we just ignore it. So I think that's the issue, that it's fine to be robust, but it's not great that you have to be robust when you're wading through what is a toxic sludge on something which is supposed to be fun and it's supposed to be a way of connecting.
But obviously, if we've got a situation where COVID is obviously, I get it. Even today, yesterday they've now classed it as flu. It's effectively a flu strain. So I guess yes, we're out of it in a sense. But obviously, the lockdowns have happened. The habits have been formed, So now we've got a lot of kids on devices, a lot more. I mean, ours are on a lot more than they used to be. Like you said, we control it, but
Yeah, and the social media platforms themselves, there's no denying that they've got to take responsibility for this. My daughter in the first term at university, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, I'm sure I'll bet it one way or another, but one of the things, because she was struggling a little bit, with the change of environment, she spent more time on her phone, and then she'd be pulled into the world of YouTube, where it just kept showing them constant autoplay the whole time, all the way through, and she'd lose hours of her day being pulled down this rabbit hole. And I would like to think that my daughter is a normal, well-adjusted human being. So even then, there are still danger points. And you're right, COVID has made it worse because we've got used to staring at devices and got used to being on social media and got used to that whole thing. I mean, like I said, it's a bit of a joke that my unique selling point was doing this over video conferencing, and now every therapist does it. But that shows how quickly things have changed in just 4 years, that we can do things like therapy over video conferencing. People are so comfortable in front of screens now that they will do something as intimate and as personal as therapy through a video screen, which is a significant shift. I really do think it is. It's another pressure. I think a positive for our kids is that they completely ignore mainstream media. I don't think my daughter has ever read a paper or seen a news program. All the way through COVID, she didn't watch any news or anything like that. So, that's one element that they don't have. I don't think to any great extent, but they do have the fact that they're then getting a lot of their information through the filter of social media, which in some ways is even worse.
And I think my concern is it's shaping a new normal. And I think what I'm also concerned with is what people are now deeming as sort of what kids need to do to fit in. And, they need to be on this platform. They need to be on this. They need to do that. Otherwise, they're going to miss out. I think that's quite worrying how quickly that's become normal. Yeah.
Especially when what's on those platforms is as I said, one of my interests is deception. But, I mean, these are platforms for deception. You're not looking at the truth. None of it is the truth. Everything, even images are filtered, stories are edited, people are desperate to make themselves appear in a certain way, as you said, to fit into this new social norm. And it's a house of cards that they're building, because none of it is based on actually what reality is. And I wonder sometimes whether that's because, again, this whole breakdown in trust with what's going on in the world around them, that some people are retreating into what is, I mean, you could argue quite effectively that the social media platforms, they create fantasy worlds that are not anything to do with reality. Yeah. In reality, we all get pimples and zits. In reality, we all have bad hair days. But on social media, you can click a button and suddenly you look perfect. We all go out to parties where it just sucks. You turn up and it's rubbish. But on social media, you'll still take a couple of photos and go, was at this party absolutely amazing? Because you're not allowed to say that the party sucked, even when it did. We all have days where we sit around and just, eat popcorn and watch TV.
100%.
But then it's given a title of chill out day or chillaxing or whatever. So it creates an artificial reality, a fantasy world.
Well, it's
that everybody tries to fit in with.
It's like the classic Instagram holidays. If you actually paid attention to an Instagram holiday, you literally would think every family is blissfully happy. Why are our holidays always stressful? Why does the airport always go wrong? And why was the weather shit?
Yeah.
And it's like a slapstick example, but it's like...
Imagine people posting the argument in the car on the way down to the airport.
Exactly.
No, you shut up.
Yeah. Whereas you've got some family on Instagram... Just setting off, can't wait, let's go.
Yeah.
I went to Dubai and sat in a restaurant, and there were people coming to the edge of the balcony, pouting, giving it all the pose. I thought that's their life.
It's frightening, isn't it?
It's unbelievable.
I went out for lunch a while ago, and the person I was with ordered just a bowl of soup, and I ordered steak, and it arrived looking very attractive. So without even asking my permission, they grabbed my steak and pulled it over and took a photo of it. And I was like, what are you doing? And they said, I'm going to stick it on Instagram. It's like, that'll be my lunch. It's like,
what?
But I said, but it isn't your lunch. You're having soup. And they're like, well, I can't put soup on Instagram, can I?
Oh,
I was
my
like,
goodness.
Then don't order soup or don't put it on Instagram. Yeah. Don't nick my lunch and then claim it as yours. Well, that's a funny story, but it shows the mentality, because in reality, it was the fact that they didn't even think to ask my permission, didn't think they needed to ask my permission. And then they were posting what was a lie.
And then I think again, I know that's like you said, it's a light-hearted example, but these habits that are forming, and obviously again, my concern going back to mental health is, I think the reality is we have no idea what we're messing with. Like I think that's the reality. I think we all know, and again, like you said, the media is probably going too far a bit, but it's like I think what we don't get what's happening right now. We don't know what is shifting, and what the outcome of this is going to be.
No, and there's a number of people out there who do put the argument very effectively that social media is the largest mass social experiment we've ever done, except for the fact that it's not an experiment. It's uncontrolled, it's not planned, it's grown from nothing to being an essential part of a lot of people's lives. And you're right, we have no idea what that means. Human beings aren't mentally constructed to deal realistically with more than, depending on who you read, 50 to 100 people. You know, our brains are still hardwired for tribal life.
Dunbar's, I heard about this the other day, Dunbar's law or Dunbar's rule, where you're...
That rings a bell. There's also, I mean, but the essential point is that even 200 years ago, we were still tribal. Even now, a lot of the world is still tribal.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just come back to me. It's 150 people, according to Dunbar's law, is the optimum amount of social connections in a tribe. Yeah. As in for protection, for genetics. For,
exactly. That idea. Yeah. But those are social connections in the real world. Now suddenly people have thousands, millions of followers, and what does that mean? How does that work? We're not designed to do that. And like I said, it's a massive social experiment, but without any controls in place, without any outcome planned, without even any kind of theory as to why we're doing it. And that's not to say that it will end badly. And there's no denying that social media has lots of positives. Yeah. But there's that negative element to it. And I think there is a tendency for us all to keep sweeping it under the carpet, as I said, and we'll push it down the road. We'll worry about it when it actually becomes a problem. But it definitely feeds into depression. I mean, if you are feeling bad about yourself, there is probably no worse place to go than social media.
Exactly.
Because suddenly, as you said, everybody's having the best time of their lives. Kids' holidays are a good example. For years, I've said, when I go on holiday, when I went on holiday, it wasn't a holiday for me; it was a business trip, because my kid's there, and it's not that. I mean, there might be wonderful moments, but that whole stylized view of it is wrong.
Yeah, and you can't tell that truth.
But equally, more importantly, what's wrong with telling the truth?
Exactly.
I mean, it wasn't so long ago that, it used to be a bit of a comedy thing, didn't it? That people were like, I'm bringing the holiday photos out, and people would be like, no, don't do it. Yeah. And we didn't want to see people's holiday photos. Now, suddenly, it's people are creating this entire fantasy.
And I think what I'm really concerned about, and I know, is people have enough to worry about. And I guess what I'm really getting at, and this is, my devil's advocate question of the over diagnoses and things like that is not coming from a cynical place. It's coming from what's the right way to manage it. Yeah. But I think what I'm concerned about is people have enough to deal with, especially with what's happened. Cost of living, which is still obviously horrific. People are just trying to get by, but then they've got these added pressures of societal norms, societal pressures, these pressures that people are putting on themselves. Are we really surprised that anxiety and depression is where it's at? I don't know. I don't know. That's my hypothesis. I don't know.
Yeah, and that feels instinctively right, but I have no evidence to say one way or the other.
No, and sorry, I know I've derailed.
Because it's fine. Yeah. It's one of those things where it's really difficult to. I mean, you couldn't empirically test it. So all we can do is keep looking at the data, and the problem is that by the time we've realised what's happened, it might be too late to turn the corner. But I honestly don't know, and I mean there might be people out there who do know that, and there probably are. I mean, I know that there are plenty of researchers who are looking at this and questioning it. But for me, there is a simple fundamental question, which is if social media is at best a fantasy. Sorry, I keep banging the microphone. At best a fantasy land. And there are lots of people who don't use social media to no detriment, and I'm one of them. It's not as if I don't have a social life. I do. And when I do meet people, it's delightful for them because they actually get to tell me all of their stuff. Because, you see other people, they meet up and they say, oh, so how's it been? And they go, well, you've seen it on Facebook. It's like, well, then the conversation just dies, whereas people meet me and they can tell me all about their lives and show me photos on their phones. And it's, a proper social interaction. So if there's no detriment to not being on social media, and social media is this fantasy land, why does it exist? Why do people feel they have to be on it? I mean, I genuinely don't understand myself.
No. And by the way, this is coming from someone who was very active on social media. I got really excited when it started, but it tipped over for me a year or two ago. So, but look, I feel like I'm sort of taking us away slightly from...
Okay.
No. But I think, by the way, I think your answers were superb. I think I don't want to use the conversation to sort of validate some of my theories. It's just I'm genuinely concerned about what you're saying in terms of the lack of...
Your concern is definitely out there with lots of other people. And I would like to think the social media companies themselves, it's not to their benefit at the end of the day to become toxic. And they're learning that, aren't they? They're learning that if they go too far one way, then people leave.
Yeah.
And people can leave.
But also their aim is to keep people on those platforms as long as possible.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. Yeah.
So I think they probably are trying to encourage the fantasy element more than the toxic element.
Yeah.
But I myself, I'm not sure whether that fantasy element is any more healthy.
Absolutely.
Because that can very quickly tip over into, FOMO and all the horrendous stuff that goes with it. We can't live in a fantasy land. We have to live in reality. And the reality is that reality sucks a lot of the time.
Yeah. And that's okay. And we need to learn that that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And for a long time we did. We accepted that. And people's escape into fantasy was in things like books and movies and video games and music and the creative arts. And that was brilliant and helpful and a release. I'm not sure social media is fulfilling that same brief.
So if I'm thinking, so obviously we've got a dearth of therapists out there. There's lots of people with all these problems. I know you have to take everything on a case-by-case basis, I assume, but are there any general tips that you could give or any guidance or any high-level stuff that for people out there that maybe are suffering or are having challenges?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I would say, and this cannot be said enough, and I know people have said it before, there should be no stigma about mental health. If you are suffering from a mental health issue, it is exactly the same as if you catch your hand in a car door or you get hit by a bus or you catch a virus. These things happen and there should be no stigma about it just because you can't physically show a sign for it.
I think also on that point, we've got three people in the room who take it very seriously because we've all had hope you don't mind me saying.
No, I was going to say earlier on, I had anxiety and depression, and I haven't been anything like the things that you guys have been through. But I mean, having a panic attack where you don't know where your heart's going to pump out your chest, it's terrifying. Yeah. And I had to take beta blockers for years because every time I saw someone, I'd have massive panic attacks. Couldn't control it. But I never actually, I didn't really see anyone about it. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. Every day, my mind was just ticking over, and it became so mentally fatiguing after a while. But after a while, I did loads of research, and it's interested when you said earlier on about the self-diagnosis stuff. But I read a lot of books to try and find my way out of it because in my early 20s, no one really talked about it. I didn't talk about it with my friends, or I kind of kept it to myself. But
do you mind me asking? I know I shouldn't be the one asking questions, but why didn't you?
Why didn't I tell anybody?
Why didn't you tell anybody or talk to anybody?
I spoke to Nicole about it. My wife, she tried to understand and empathise the best she could, but she'd never been through it, so she didn't really kind of understand.
So why didn't you talk to anybody else?
I maybe mentioned it to a couple of friends.
So why do you feel that way? Sorry. I felt like I was doing therapy about it. Sorry.
A couple of friends about it. But I generally kept it to myself. So in situations, I couldn't look people in the eye. I was so nervous. It was just deliberate. You said earlier on, it was a horrible time. But
it is, yeah.
I found this amazing book that kind of explained exactly, and you talked earlier on about anxiety levels. We need anxiety, and I get that as well. And, you know, I do talks in front of people, you know, you still get the butterflies and things like that. I mean, I had an event on Saturday, the butterflies are there driving to the hotel, but it's normalised. But I went through a point where my nervous system was so agitated, the phone would ring or the toaster, you know, to the point you gave earlier on, it frightened the crap out of me because it was just so shot to pieces. But reading a book by Dr. Claire Weeks, it just explained why your nervous system was like that, and it was like a light bulb moment. And from that point onward, it kind of dissipated, and it took time to normalise. But and then, you know, after that point,
well, I mean, that kind of comes to the point I was making about the fact that you found a way through it.
Yeah.
But if you'd have had the right help, you would have been able to get there much quicker.
That's
I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, and it was a couple of years. 2 or 3
and I don't know
years.
if you felt any stigma about it. I mean, it sounds like you did
I
talk
at
to
the
some
time, 'cause
people.
It was
I did,
25 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely felt that.
All right, okay. 25 years ago, yeah, you were just weird.
I was a long time ago. Yeah, but exactly. That's
I'm
my
joking.
point.
I'm joking.
But that's how I felt. You know, I thought, well, yeah, you know, if I talk about it at work with someone, because I was standing in front of a customer, 20 people, talking about something, presenting something I wasn't really that up to speed on, and everyone was looking at me. I just froze. Someone had to bring me a glass of water. It was terrifying. But then, you know, like to your point, going through difficulties and coming out the other side of it, and now asked to present in front of hundreds of people at work at conferences, and I feel like I've gone through that the other side. But like you say, maybe I'd have come out the other side a lot quicker had I seen something.
Well, perhaps. I mean, there's no guarantees. But, I mean, as I said, the high point for me of that would be there shouldn't be any stigma about it. That's rule number one.
Yeah.
Rule number two for me would be... I'm not sure I'm phrasing this the right way in terms of rules, but the second thing I would say is that don't try and self-diagnose. The internet is not a helpful place for mental health. I'm not an expert enough to know, but I suspect it's not a helpful place for clinical diagnosis, but it definitely isn't for mental health issues. And it can pull you into some quite horrible places. As we know, and we've seen evidence of this. So don't try and self-diagnose. So first of all, don't get the stigma in your head. Don't think that there's something wrong with you. Everybody suffers mental health issues in their life of some sort or another. It's the price we pay for being clever creatures, you know. I mean, we process so much information. We are social beings. Things go wrong. Even the most robust human being will suffer mental health issues to some extent. So don't feel the stigma, don't self-diagnose. Talk to people, and it doesn't have to be a professional. Talk to friends, because you'll be surprised how many of them will also have suffered mental health issues. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been able to shut down my website, partly was because it wasn't serving its purpose, but because most of my work now, virtually all of it, is from referrals. So people are becoming more open about it. So they will be at a dinner party and somebody will be talking about something, and then afterwards they'll have a quiet word and say, well, it sounds as if you're struggling with something at the moment. I spoke to this guy, give him a call. And there doesn't have to be an acknowledgement that there's any specifics about the mental health issues involved, but it's a general knowledge, a general feeling that, you know, we are there to support each other. And by being more open about it, it will help with some of the issues, I think, personally. But the third thing I would say is don't be afraid of getting professional help. Again, it can be quite daunting talking to a therapist, but we're all really nice, honestly. But when you're talking to a therapist, it is like talking to a doctor about a clinical issue. We have to follow the same rules. We are confidential, we're compassionate, and we are there to help. That's our primary purpose. We have no agenda other than to help people. So don't be afraid of talking to a therapist or talking to your GP. You know, there's always help out there. And a rough rule of thumb is that the sooner you can get help, I mean, you shouldn't, you know, wake up one morning and feel, I feel a bit anxious today, go rush it. You know, there has to be a balance. But the sooner you can get help with a particular issue, mental health issue, the better it will be in the long term. It's when these things spiral that it gets really bad. There's nothing wrong with clinical depression in itself. It's if it goes untreated, it can then lead to much darker places and potentially horrendous things like suicide and things like that. And the same with anxiety. Anxiety in itself isn't a bad thing. If it starts spiraling out of control, if you deal with it pretty quickly, then it can be dealt with easily. if you let it spiral, then you can get to the point where you do have panic attacks, and even things like people get shut-in and you get shut-ins and agoraphobia and all those kind of things. People get to the point where they can no longer operate, and that's when it's gone too far. So the sooner you can get help, the better. I would also finally say, and this is more my own personal opinion than anything else, resist the temptation to put things into convenient buckets. So it's not necessarily always helpful to think, oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I've got anxiety. Oh, I'm stressed. There's often interplays going on there that are more subtle than that. So if you think you're depressed and you say you're depressed to your GP and they give you antidepressants, that may not, and they might not work. And then you think, well, that's it, that's rubbish. It may be that you weren't actually depressed. There was something else going on there that was showing the same signs as depression.
Like grief, for example.
Exactly. Or trauma, or, it's very hard as to internalise this stuff. I mean, it's the big difference. And it's kind of why I object to the NHS running mental health services. Again, this is definitely my own personal opinion here, but there's a big difference between clinical and mental health issues, in that mental health issues you can only base, I know I talked about neuroscience earlier and stuff like that, but largely we can only base it on the behavioural cues that we see. So my diagnostic process is based on behavioural information that I'm picking up from talking to people. Now, I can do targeted questioning, I can do various exercises with them to gain more information, but it's still only what they're telling me. I can't see in their heads, and there's no light that goes on that says depression, anxiety. I wish there was. It would make my life a lot easier, but there isn't. So I would say to people, don't think in terms of just depression or anxiety. I would say if you are feeling like you can't cope with the world, and that's a general thing, that moment when you start thinking that you're not operating in the right way, seek some professional help, because they can help you. And be open-minded about it. I mean, one of the struggles I have is that people come along and they think that they've got X, and I've then got to spend time convincing them that they don't have X, they've got Y, and that's what I need to treat. Because people can come with very fixed ideas. And
I think that ties a bit into what I was trying to get at earlier, is it's not, again, to sort of be in any way cynical. It's like you said, these conclusions that people seem to make about what they think they have. And it's like, but you could be talking yourself down a rabbit hole that's making it worse for you.
Well, that's what I mean about earlier intervention, it stops that process. Or talking to people around you. I mean, the moment you shine a light on this stuff, it generally starts getting better. And that's what I mean about not being afraid to talk to people, not feeling like there's actually something wrong with you other than the actual issue itself. So
and I think it's also just making sure that you don't try and label something so that you can so that then that's what it is. So, no, you're not going deep enough on what actually you need to deal with as well. I'm conscious we've been going 3.5 hours. I could go on for 18 days, and I really want to, but I think we need to be fair on you, but also I think we're in uncharted territory, because I love long podcasts, but I don't know if our listeners do. So please feel free to give us
some heavy editing required. I think
we're in part 6. We're in part 6 in a minute,
and I think we could have broken this, but I just think it's been amazing. It's been such an amazing conversation.
No, it's been really good.
I really don't.
It's weird talking about your life.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say thank you so much for sharing everything.
No, my pleasure.
And again, I think this has taken a really good journey, and I think there's so many learnings that it's going to be difficult to summarise. But even just saying yes to things, the way that you've dealt with the sort of ups and downs in some of the journey that you've been on, and and again, I think it shows a real realness for people to listen to. But then also, how do you turn those into a positive? And I'm personally taking a lot of inspiration. I'm actually sitting here right now genuinely thinking, and I've talked to you about this before, that I want to retrain in what you're doing, especially if there's such a demand for it. So I think it's really inspirational, and but I think also just been great hearing your story, and
which is an incredible story as well. thank you for being so transparent.
And of course, I don't see it that way because I lived it. So
it's unbelievable. But I love, like Ad said, I love the way you've turned it into positive, and now you're using that as a platform to help other people as well. It's really admirable.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of satisfaction from that because it did completely change my worldview on therapists.
Yeah.
I was a bit dismissive originally because I was on the harder science side of things, like I said. But now I think it's a vital part of anybody's life.
Yeah.
Should be a vital part of anybody's life.
If you're open to it, Chris, I don't know what you think, Az, but I think obviously we've spent a lot of time today talking about your story and then moving into some mental health is such a big area. I'd love to come back and maybe dig a bit deeper into that or cover more of it or more tips or anything because it is such a big challenge out there at the moment.
Well, we'll see how this podcast goes. If it lands like a lead balloon, then maybe not.
It's such a hot topic, Chris. I mean, everyone knows someone that's suffered for it.
Yeah.
And I think talking about it if it helps one person, then it's worth us doing it. So
okay. Yeah, more than happy to. Well, as you say, even if it just helps one person, even if one person listens to my advice, then and it changes things, and it's worth it. It always is.
Absolutely.
No matter what you do, So, I mean, if there is one downside, I think, of me not being on social media, it's that I don't get my voice out there as much as I would particularly like. But that's a personal choice for me that I'm not prepared to get exposed to all the crap of social media. So I try on Twitter to post stuff, but I'm rubbish. So it doesn't really happen. Sorry, X.
Yeah, I'll never get my head around that.
Nobody can. That's what it's officially known now as X, formerly known as Twitter, isn't it? I mean, that's what everybody does.
Well, I really want you to ask the question that you always ask.
I was thinking about dropping that, but I can.
I want to see what the answer is.
Right. Well, Chris, so I always tend to ask this at the end of every podcast. I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could go back to your earlier years, as you were just starting out in Waitrose as that manager of the elocution lessons, you could go back to that, Chris, with the broad West Country accent and give him one piece of advice.
West Country? I was Brummie.
Brummie, that's what I mean. But based on what you've learned in all these years and all the experiences you've had, what would that be? One piece of advice.
God.
Just say no.
Say no to everything because it's all been a disaster.
Wasn't that from Grange Hill?
It's a bit generic and maybe a bit trite, but it would be genuinely have more self-belief, have more confidence in yourself. That was the thing I struggled with for a long time when I was younger. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence. I was cripplingly shy as a child, couldn't even go into a shop to buy anything. I would walk in with the best of intentions, but then I would freeze, and so it would, and that was a problem for a long time. So certainly if I went back to those kind of years, it would be, have some faith in yourself, have some self-belief, and also, base that on practicalities of the fact that everybody feels that way. It's just that some people are better at dealing with it than others, by which I mean everybody feels anxiety, everybody feels, when they stand up in front of a group of, as you say, stand up in front of hundreds of people, everybody has that butterfly feeling. Some people are better at dealing with it than others, but that doesn't mean they don't have it. Yeah. So believe in yourself a bit more, have a bit more confidence. Because that was the thing that did lead to the say yes philosophy. It was a very brute force tactic. It forced me more and more to go into more and more situations. So I learned to deal with it. But if I was able to deal with it earlier, then I don't know, maybe my life would have been different.
I think it's great advice. And we've mentioned this on a previous episode, but there was something that we listened to a few weeks back where it was saying when you live outside of your comfort zone, it does something to the is it the prefrontal cortex or something in your brain that benefits from taking yourself outside?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it's been proven time and again. So when you push yourself in those uncomfortable situations, whether you wanted to or not, by saying yes and doing that, you've probably massively gained from that. So
Oh, absolutely. It's why I'm a big fan of travel. It's fun. Well, most of the time it's fun, but what you're doing is exposing yourself to constant new stimuli, and that is great. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that helps stave off dementia and things. Having that extra stimuli all the time. Our brains are designed to learn, and the moment you stop that process, I think it's to your detriment.
Learning new languages is supposed to be fantastic for the brain as well. But new cultures, new people.
So the reason I'm laughing is the one thing I cannot do is learn languages.
Is it?
I am useless. I got an E at GCSE. I have tried everything. My wife is half Spanish. I've tried everything I can, and I cannot learn. So yeah, so that would. But you're right. Learning new languages is a great way of doing things. Learning any new skill, but it's all about stimuli.
Yeah.
Whether it's a new language, a new book, new music, or going and traveling, or talking to new people, or whatever it is. Anything that's new makes your brain light up.
Yeah.
Sort of in terms of this is something new, and it then has to process that.
Yeah.
Which creates new synapses and new ways of thinking, and that's got to be good overall.
I'm sure you got one more university degree left in you yet, Chris. We could do in linguistics.
But you can't. Something will happen, and you won't be able to finish it.
Well, wait a minute. I did finish my 2 degrees and my 2 masters. It was my PhD I didn't finish.
That's a bit unfair.
Yeah, thanks. I did. I've got certificates I can put up on the wall as well.
I was going to say you're a lot further down the road than I am, so I don't know what I'm talking about. Look, I mean, again, I wish we could just carry on, but. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to just do round 2. And
no, absolutely. Let's see how it goes.
I mean, honestly, again, what an amazing discussion. Well, if we do say so ourselves, but maybe it's crap.
But we have been really genuinely excited to get you on, Chris. And we've tried for months, and obviously, for whatever reason, we've not been able to. So I really appreciate it.
It's been a fascinating experience. Yeah. I've been obviously thinking about it beforehand. And it is an odd experience to stop and look back on your life. It's not something I think most people do. So thank you. You've given me a new stimulus.
Brilliant.
I mean, I had to go back and dig out my old A-level certificates because I genuinely couldn't remember what year I graduated. I was like, what year I did them, because I've been alive for far too long. But no, it's been really good. Thank you.
And had we known the content of the episode, we could have even asked you to come on anyway. We knew you were going to say yes, right? So we shouldn't have worried about it.
Didn't even need to ask. I should have spooked you in.
Yeah.
Well, I did say yes, didn't I?
Yeah, exactly.
You did.
Chris, thank you so much. It's been fantastic.
Oh, thank you. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah,
amazing.
Thank you.
Wow, what a conversation with Chris. We really hope you enjoyed that. Just so grateful to be able to sit down with Chris, get all of the insights from the mental health crisis and epidemic that obviously this country is going through, get more and more learnings as we did in the first half of the podcast on Chris's take on life, the insights that we get from the twists and turns that he's been through. Just so much to learn for and absorb, and really hope you found that as well. Thanks again to Chris. So moving forward over the next couple of weeks, we've got some really interesting discussions coming up. First of all, we're going to talk about some of the recent experiences that Pete and I have had around my health. Pete's also running the London Marathon next weekend, which we're going to do some insights from. And then also we've got all of our normal great guests coming up. So we've got some coming from the world of business, from charity, from sport, health and well-being. So many different areas to cover. Really looking forward to it, and really excited about the momentum that we're having now. Thanks to everybody who's supporting the podcast and listening. Please do remember to tell your friends, to subscribe if you can, and follow whatever platform you're listening on. It really does help us. We're trying to spread this message as far and as wide as possible, so any support really is helpful. Until next week, have a great week. Make the most of every day. There's another way.